Today's webinar is titled Phase 4 Guidelines for Museums and Theaters. I'm going to review, there's a lot of content to cover today, so I apologize, I will be talking quickly. I'm going to review the new Phase 4 guidelines for museums and theaters. And by theaters, I mean both performance venues and movie theaters. So we'll be covering a lot of content today, so please bear with me as we move quickly through that. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as possible today. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat function on the webinar. You'll notice that there is both a chat and a Q&A. Please use the chat function. That's the easiest way for me to see the questions come in through the PowerPoint. Also, again, with a lot of content and a 45-minute presentation, it may be the case that I do not get to every question, so I apologize in advance for that. You'll see, though, at the bottom of every slide, you will see a email address, BACP outreach at cityofchicago.org. You can send any follow-up questions, or if there's anything that I don't get to, or frankly, I am unable to answer and I need to consult with some of my colleagues before providing an answer, you can send that email to bacpoutreach at cityofchicago.org, and I'll follow up, or someone from my team will follow up as quickly as possible to get answers to your questions. This webinar will be recorded, and you can find it at chicago.gov/business workshops. That's where you can find, you'll be able to find a recording of this webinar. Hopefully, it'll be up there by tomorrow. All the information in the webinar, however, can be found at our reopening website, chicago.gov/reopening. So I'm going to jump in. I see a couple questions coming through. I will be covering most of those questions. So I will jump into the guidelines specifically. And if I do not answer some of the guidelines questions, do make sure to ask. So the agenda for today, again, we're covering museums and theaters. That's actually 3 different guidelines that you'll be able to find on the reopening website. There's one specifically for museums, then there's one for movie theaters, and there's a different set of guidelines for performance venues. You'll notice, however, that the movie theaters and that the performance venues guidelines are very similar, so those will be covered together. So the agenda for today, I'm going to provide an overview of Phase 4, why we're here, what it means for the whole city. I'm going to talk about the detailed reopening guidance for museums and theaters. This will include both indoor and outdoor venues. I'm going to talk about some additional reopening resources and some enforcement. I'll talk a little bit about enforcement and what your operational requirements are as you're reopening under Phase 4. Again, it's here, it's in bold. I typed it into the chat. Please, if you have not done so already, please visit chicago.gov/reopening. All the resources you need to guide your reopening can be found there. So a little bit about what Phase 4 means for the city of Chicago. As the mayor announced and the health commissioner announced early this week, the city is ready to enter Phase 4 this Friday, June 26th. Please note, this is the same day that the rest of the state will be moving to Phase 4. However, the guidelines for the city of Chicago are different than the rest of the state. So what does Phase 4 mean for the city of Chicago? The name of the phase is gradually resume. So the goal here is to further reopen Chicago while ensuring the safety of residents. So let me make it abundantly clear that the data, the health data that we're looking at to make decisions about reopening, the data has been very positive. We are trending very much in the correct direction, but we are not out of the woods yet. So there are safety restrictions, there are capacity restrictions that are in place under this, that will remain in place under Phase 4, and that they are a little bit different than the rest of the state. And that's because the outbreak in Chicago has been different than the rest of the state. Now we're hoping we can expand capacity soon, but for now that is the case. So Additional businesses will be opening. For the most part, most businesses can at least reopen in some capacity under phase 4 with some limited restrictions that, again, I will be covering through this presentation. Public amenities can open, but folks should continue to physically distance and should be continuing to wear a face covering. You'll see across all the guidelines, face coverings are in place and physically distancing is required. And then lastly, for when it comes to health, and this is very, very important. This is not just for your industry. This is really across the board. Folks should continue to distance, allow vulnerable residents to shelter at home as needed. And if you have symptoms of COVID-19, do not play the hero. You should be staying home and you should be getting tested. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you are sick, you should continue to stay home. There's still a health order in place, in fact, in the city of Chicago, requiring you to do so. If you are sick with COVID-19 symptoms, even if your industry is reopening, you should stay home and you should be getting tested. Again, please stay home if you are sick with COVID-19. We've made very good progress, but we're still having hundreds of cases a day, still having people die every single day. We're having new cases in every single zip code in the city of Chicago every single day. So again, we're not out of the woods yet. So a little bit about phase 4 and what it means across the board, not just about the industries we're covering today. So childcare is opening and summer programs will be opening under phase 4. Some city services, parks and libraries. You'll know the lakefront opened just 2 days ago. Office-based jobs will continue to be reopening. Hotels and lodging and outdoor attractions. Retail stores, ones that were non-essential, they've been able to reopen under phase 3. Personal services can continue reopening. You'll find under phase 4 that we're expanding it to allow for certain personal service activities that require face coverings to be removed for a short period of time. Those can reopen. Health and fitness clubs can reopen under phase 4 for indoor classes or for indoor exercise. Restaurants and bars can reopen under phase 4 for indoor dining. Places of worship, they reopened in the middle of phase 3. Zoos, museums, performance venues, and movie theaters, our focus for today, can reopen under specific safety guidance. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these and what this means in just 1 minute. So I really want to, again, point you all to the chicago.gov/reopening site. Here you'll find those industry guidelines. You'll find some self-certification resources. You'll also find additional resources, national, state, and even international resources, along with posters, health-focused posters that you can download that have been made by the city. You can also submit any questions you have to 311. And again, you'll see this email address on the bottom of every single page. Please email BACP outreach@cityofchicago.org with any questions. So last slide before we get into some of the specific guidelines, I want to provide an overview of all of the different industry guidelines for, I believe there's 20 different industries, something around there, that you can find on the reopening site. They're all split up into 3 different categories. The first is healthy interactions, and this includes social distancing. You'll see across the board, 6 feet is that magic number. So 6 feet of social distancing is still the requirement, and that will be the requirement for a while. That is something that, again, you'll see across the board. Gathering size across the board at all different industries will be limited to 25% capacity for indoor spaces with a maximum of 50. Again, that is across the board in the city of Chicago, with some very, very small exceptions for essential retail. But all other indoor spaces have a gathering size limit of 25% with a maximum of 50. That's the case for restaurants reopening inside. That's the case for health and fitness clubs, yoga studios, anything like that. And that's the case for museums, and that's the case for performance venues and movie theaters. Protective gear, face coverings should be worn at all times. Again, there's minor exceptions, which I'll talk about today, but the science is clear on this subject. Face coverings save lives. You should be wearing You should be wearing face coverings truly at all times, except for minor instances, which I'll talk about where they can be removed. And obviously, you should have hygiene requirements, hand sanitizing, things like that everywhere. You should be ensuring safe spaces and conditions, entry access, ways to limit entry access, cleaning standards, visual guidance posted around your establishment, and workplace conditions in place to ensure safety and health. Then finally, operational resilience and monitoring. This is all about what can you do as a business owner, as a business, an employer or employee to keep folks safe into the future. Contact tracing, things like that. Travel guidelines, etc. You'll also find on all the guidelines that you'll have a glossary. There's details for what a self screening questionnaire looks like, things like that. Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit. First, I'm going to talk about museums. I'm going to cover this pretty quickly. Then I'm going to jump into performance venues and movie theaters. And then I'm going to open it up for questions. I do see plenty coming through. I think I'll be answering most of these. But I do want to make sure to cover the guidelines, and then I'll kind of answer the detailed questions that I missed. So first, I'm going to talk about museums. And by museums, I mean certainly large venue museums. I also mean art galleries, anything like that that doesn't fit into retail, that doesn't fit into personal services, but where folks, come in, they browse, they look around, and then they leave. And it's not a retail store, it's not a personal service. So art galleries would fit into these guidelines. So what will you see for museums? Here's a nice visual to see a little bit about what it looks like. Interactive experiences may be adapted or temporarily closed to reduce contact. Museum movement flow should be controlled to prevent overcrowding and promote physical distancing. Employees should be frequently disinfecting museum facilities. You should have sanitation spaces readily available throughout facilities. Employees and visitors should be wearing face coverings. You should have visual signage posted throughout museums, and group tours should be temporarily discontinued to promote social distancing. So that's a brief overview. I'm now going to go over this in more detail. Great. Okay, so first, social distancing. This means 6 feet between individuals and close choke points. You should be ensuring that visitors and staff are practicing physical distancing, maintaining 6 feet while standing in lines, using elevators, and moving around facilities. If practical, you should be providing physical barriers where social distancing is not possible, for example, at your box office ticketing, things like that. You should be limiting both table capacity and gathering space to ensure social distancing. This means limiting capacity to 25% for all indoor spaces and exhibits. So if you have entirely separate rooms, for example, each one should be limited to a capacity of 25%. Groups in attendance should be limited to no more than 50. And you should ensure that gatherings of employees in cafeterias, meeting rooms, and other gathering points does not exceed 50. You should be temporarily discontinuing group tours, and you should be ensuring that audio equipment for self-guided audio tours is thoroughly cleaned and sanitized between uses. So now a couple questions related to these capacity limits. Again, I see a question, 25% occupancy is per each space in the museum. And that's the case really across different industries. You'll find that for restaurants as well, 25% capacity for each different room. I had a question, does the 50-person max include staff? This really depends on the nature of that staff. If the staff is within that space at all times, like a security guard, for example, that is within the space all day at all times, then they would be counted towards the 50%. But if a staff is kind of has separate facilities, is just in and out of a location, and is not spending most of their time within a location, then it would not include staff. So that is really up to the specific business to determine whether that 50 max of 50 and that 25% capacity is based whether it includes staff. Had a question about how you determine that capacity. So, most places do have capacity as determined by the buildings department or the fire department, your occupancy. If you have an occupancy placard, then it is 25% of that. If you do not have an occupancy placard or a capacity limit, then it is up to the establishment themselves to determine what their typical capacity would be and to take 25% of that. I see a couple questions about benchmarks to increase the 25%. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. I'm gonna, again, a couple more questions will be answered in just a little bit, and then I'll open it for a little bit more time. Face coverings, again, must be worn over nose and mouth. Exceptions can be made for people with medical conditions or disabilities. If it is practical, you should be providing disposable gloves for employees if they are transacting business with visitors. You should be promoting hygienic interactions, encourage frequent hand washing and or sanitizing. You should be certainly providing hand sanitizer or disinfectants at minimum at entry points, if not throughout the entire location, and ensuring that staff and visitors have access to hand sanitizer and or hand washing stations throughout their business. If applicable, you should be ensuring that, providing gloves, things like that for high touch services or closing off access. Regarding face coverings, now you're not required to provide face coverings to guests, but guests should not be in your location without face covering. So if someone shows up without one, that's kind of a determination of the business, whether you will provide them or you would just not allow them to enter. Again, exceptions can be made for people with medical conditions or disabilities. So again, for touch surfaces, you should be either ensuring hygienic interactions with those by providing gloves or a stylus, something like that, or you should be closing access to those places. You should be implementing a screening measure for employees and customers. This means at minimum, employees should be self-screening to ensure that they don't have symptoms. That means at minimum, employees should be asking themselves a series of questions before coming into work. Do I have symptoms of COVID-19? And if they do, they should be staying home. Now, we encourage more than that, certainly. We encourage folks to do temperature checks, to have the employer ask questions of their employees, but at minimum, you should be doing a self-screening. And you can find language for that self-screen on the guidelines at the reopening website. You should also be posting a pledge upon your entrance, or if you would like, do even more and conducting a screening to verify that guests are not currently currently exhibiting COVID-19 symptoms. So again, at minimum, post a pledge, something saying, by entering this facility, you pledge to not have COVID-19 symptoms. But you can do more, and we encourage more. Temperature checks, questions, things like that. You should be frequently, daily and overnight cleaning work surfaces with EPA registered cleaning products. Again, you can find links to some information on that on our reopening website. You should be providing visual guidance throughout the establishment. Floor markings for 6 feet distance. Again, I saw questions about folks queuing up, entering establishment all at once. You should be making sure that people are 6 feet apart while they are doing that. Floor markings, signage, things like that. Potentially, depending on your facility, maybe arrows to designate flow of traffic to make sure people are not walking kind of in opposite directions where they may get close to each other. You should be communicating standards and expectations proactively where possible before arrival. So potentially at your website, via email. We recommend folks to make reservations potentially if you for establishments. If people buy tickets ahead of time, they should be receiving a communication about the standards prior to arrival. You should be adjusting museum navigation to ensure social distancing while making sure ADA accessibility is in place. If you have unnecessary touch surfaces or shared equipment, access to that should be closed. Questions about airflow and ventilation. Where appropriate, you should be propping open doors or windows. There's also some additional guidelines on ventilation that you can I'm going to type in the website at chicago.gov/coronavirus. There's some additional resources you can find about proper ventilation, but non-hygienic, you should be ensuring, airflow, things like that. Did I just? Yep, sorry, just went back a slide. I apologize. Great. I had a question. This is a great question. I'll pause for just 1 second. Non-symptomatic family members that are all coming together as one group, we encourage them to remain 6 feet away as much as possible. But if they're all kind of within that same party, within the same group, family members, then they can be closer than 6 feet. Same as with restaurants, for example, folks within the same party can be sitting at the same table, but they should be 6 feet away from all other groups. You should be limiting in-person work where possible. So non-essential staff that don't need to be on site, if they can work remotely, we encourage that to still occur. Staggered report times, A and B shifts, limiting in-person trainings, things like that. Let's keep doing online trainings, online work meetings, keep doing that. Encourage contactless transactions as much as possible. And again, where possible, restrict attendance to reservation only. Obviously, it really depends on the venue, but reservation only is something we are strongly encouraging. You should be limiting staff travel across multiple locations. The less folks people interact with, the better. And then this is important. This is something for both museums and venues. Should be following health and CDC guidelines for testing and tracing protocol. You should not be surprised and caught off guard if an employee tests positive for COVID-19. You should be prepared for that happening. Let's hope it doesn't, but you should be prepared. It's, again, hundreds of cases every day, cases in every single zip code every day. Be prepared and know what to do. So there's CDC guidelines. You can go to that coronavirus website for more information. If an employee does have close contact with someone with COVID-19, they should self-quarantine. This, again, we're not out of the woods from this health crisis. If you have 2 or more cases possibly associated with an establishment, they're required to report those cases to the health department. So that's an overview of the guidelines for museums. I'm going to take a quick minute or two to answer a couple of questions that came through, and then I'm going to jump into venues and theaters. Sorry, let me just scroll through some of these questions that have come through. I think it covered a lot of those. Again, 25% capacity, 50 max per space. Do you have to notify visitors who were here if an employee tests positive? That is not something that it is formally recommended. The health department has really the folks that should be notified are those that are within 6 feet of somebody for 10 or more minutes. That's what we're calling really close contact. So you do not need to notify everybody, but it also really depends on the specifics of that case. Again, I would recommend you check out chicago.gov/coronavirus. There's detailed guidance for businesses and employers about everything related to the health aspect of all this, including detailed steps that should be taken in order to, in case someone tests positive. So, and if you want, you can send us an email at bacpoutreach@citychicago.org, and I will send you directly those detailed guidance for businesses and employees. Great. This presentation will be recorded. We will not be sending out the PowerPoint. However, all of this information is on the guidelines, which you can find at chicago.gov/reopening. Now, I see a couple questions come through that are kind of related to the theaters and venues. So I'm going to jump into theaters and venues really quickly. I'm going to cover these guidelines and then answer additional questions that have come through. So again, these guidelines that I'm going to cover right now are for both movie theaters and performance venues. So this is for any sort of concert venue, any sort of theater, anything like that is what I'm going to be covering right now. Again, these will be and can be reopening under phase 4. One quick point for all of this, these are all the guidelines that come into effect this Friday. I don't want anybody saying, hey, Isaac told me I can reopen today. These are the phase 4 guidelines that come into effect this Friday, June 26th. So what do you see? Again, quick overview before I jump into the details. Attendees and employees are required to wear face coverings, except in the small exceptions when they are eating or drinking while seated. Rows or seats should be decommissioned to allow for social distancing. 6 feet, that's your magic number. 6 feet between groups must always be the case. Household members can be seated together with adequate distance between groups for social distancing. You'll notice the word seating here. All patrons must be seated. So if you have any standing room only general admission, that must be decommissioned. Theaters and venues can open for seating only. Visual signage should be posted throughout the facilities regarding hygiene, social distancing, proper PPE, etc. And lastly, cast and performers are not required to wear face coverings on stage. That's the only exception, but they are expected to wear them in any backstage common areas. So I'm going to cover these in a little bit more detail and hopefully answer all of these questions. So 6 feet of distance between all individuals and close choke points. That means attendees should be 6 feet away from other attendees. That means at minimum, including between the stage and the front row of seats, that should be 6 feet. Anything should be 6 feet. That means if you have fixed seating and rows are not 6 feet apart, you should be decommissioning rows in order to make sure that they are 6 feet apart. And again, this depends exactly on the venue. Some seats, sometimes just decommissioning one seat would be enough for it to be 6 feet apart. Sometimes you'll need to decommission 2 seats or 2 rows. It obviously depends on the venue, how big the seats are. It's incumbent upon the business owner themselves to make sure that seating all individuals are 6 feet apart. You should be seating members of the same household together. Children must remain with their parents and guardians at all times. And this is across the board. Areas where individuals queue should be clearly marked for 6 feet of distancing, entryways, things like that. You should also be limiting table capacity to ensure social distancing. Each indoor space, this is a couple questions that have come through. Each indoor space or room should be limited to no more than 50 individuals or 25% capacity while practicing social distancing. So, for example, a movie theater with 12 theaters, each theater should have no more than 50 individuals or 25% capacity, whichever is fewer. So each different indoor space or room should have 50 individuals or 25% capacity, whichever is fewer. So a quick point about that. If there are circumstances where they can have multiple gatherings of 50 individuals within a single theater, only with the following accommodations in place. You could have separate groups that are clearly delineated and separated by different levels or floors. For example, a balcony and then the main level of a theater. You could have 50 in the main level and 50 in the balcony, only provided that both of those are under 25% capacity, provided that they have separate entrances and exits, and have separate dedicated restroom facilities. So again, you can have the only circumstances where you can go above 50 is if they're in fully separate spaces, like a balcony and a ground floor, and they have separate entrances and exits and separate restroom facilities. Again, I see a couple questions related to this. I'm going to cover a couple more guidelines, and then I will answer those questions. Face coverings, again, must be worn over the nose and mouth, with exceptions made for people with medical conditions or disabilities. Actors or performers are not required to wear face coverings during the show, but they should be wearing face coverings for offstage activities. They're not required when attendees are eating and drinking while seated. That is the only time that an attendee can take off their face covering, when they are eating or drinking. So let me answer a couple questions related to this. First of all, I apologize, I missed this bullet. Outdoor activities can have up to 100 individuals. Again, folks must be static, must be staying still. Example, sitting at tables and practicing social distancing. So a little bit more about this capacity. So each separate theater, if you have entirely separate theaters, each one of those separate theaters can have up to 50 individuals or 25% capacity. The only time one individual theater can go above 50 individuals is if they have entirely separate spaces within that theater, such as a ground level and a balcony, and that they have separate entrances and restrooms. So again, if you have multiple different theaters within a space, each one of those can have 50 individuals or 25% capacity. And again, this 50 individuals, someone had a question, do the 50 individuals or 25% capacity apply to museums? Yes, it does as well. Again, 50 individuals or 25% capacity within each room. In a large outdoor space where attendees are required to remain seated and social distance, can more than 100 people attend? No, at this point, gatherings are limited to no more than 100 individuals for outdoor spaces. Where can I find outdoor performance guidelines? So these guidelines, so if you go to chicago.gov/reopening, you can, you'll also find some guidelines for outdoor attractions, and you can read those guidelines as well. Does the limit of 50 people include the actors on stage? That's a great question. It depends how your kind of capacity is set up. And actually, if you can, that's a great question that I think I will follow up with our Department of Buildings to get an answer on that question. So can you please submit that question via the email if the limit of 50 people includes the actors on stage? Do capacity limits apply to dressing rooms and backstage? That's a great question. Those capacity limits apply across the board on all different industries. So yes, the capacity limits do apply to dressing rooms and backstage. Does the 50% capacity include staff? Again, just like with museums, this depends exactly on what the staff are doing. If the staff are staying in that space for the entire time, then the 50% the 50 capacity should include staff. But if they're ushers, for example, that are coming in and out and leaving, then it does not need to be, then the 50 does not include staff. Sorry, I'm seeing a couple questions. If I have a program outside, it can be for 100 attendees social distance. Yes. If you have a program outside, it can be for 100 attendees socially distanced. Again, please send an email to BACP Outreach, and I will follow up with that question about if performers count towards the capacity. Do performers need to be 6 feet apart from each other during their performances? Now, that's something we're encouraging. We understand that that's not possible for every performance, but that is something that we are encouraging. Again, this question about performers, whether they count towards the 50 capacity, that's a question I understand many people have. I will get an answer to that question, and I'll actually follow up with an email to everybody that attended this webinar to make sure to get an answer to that question. Couple questions, sorry. Yeah, if you have any questions kind of specifically about your capacity, you can please send, about your specific space, please email BACP Outreach, and I will get an answer there. Is it okay to distribute programs? Yes, it is. Please, though, do make sure that proper hygiene is in place. We would recommend that maybe you have the programs just available at a table for folks to pick up instead of handing them out. I'm going to cover the rest of these guidelines before Jumping into a couple of these other questions. So you should be providing sanitation stations at minimum at the entrance of the theater and in common backstage areas. You should train all staff on the new cleaning policies and procedures prior to opening, and you should be communicating your new operating procedures to staff and general public. You should be implementing screening measures for employees and customers. This means, just like for museums, at minimum, you should be self-screening to ensure no symptoms, and employees should not be reporting to work if they have COVID-19 symptoms. You should be posting a pledge upon entrance, or again, you can do more, conducting screening to show that attendees are not exhibiting COVID-19 symptoms. Also, after entry or ticket or food purchase, you should be encouraging individuals to immediately proceed to their seats to avoid congregating in common areas. You should be cleaning entire theaters between shows and at the end of the day, and increase your cleaning frequency in public areas, such as door handles, high contact surfaces, and high traffic areas such as bathrooms. You should be posting visual guidance to promote social distancing, washing hands, etc. You can find that guidance again on the reopening site. Where possible, you should be providing info to visitors prior to their arrival, again, just like with museums, potentially on social media, on the ticketing, things like that. Again, want to emphasize you should be rearranging seating to allow for 6 feet of distancing, including blocking rows if you have fixed seating in place. You should consider removing, disabling, or spacing furniture in high-density areas such as the lobby or backstage lounges. And if applicable, you should be eliminating general admission standing rooms. Again, all patrons must be seated. You should be ensuring employees that can continue to work from home are doing so, admin employees, for example. And you should be minimizing the overlap of employees and shifts where possible. You should encourage attendees to pick their seat prior to arriving at theaters. You should be suggesting time for attendees to arrive to the theater to monitor the ingress, and stagger show and performance start and end times to minimize interaction and gathering points. You should be minimizing travel, which means if you have different performance venues, you should be limiting the amount of travel that employees are taking between venues. And again, same thing that I said for museums, you should be prepared for an employee having COVID-19. And you should be prepared to you are required to tell the health department if somebody has if you have 2 or more cases possibly associated with your establishment in a 14-day period. Again, I see additional questions come through. I will be answering additional questions, but I want to put this slide up because this is some questions that come through. Why are we at 25% capacity? Why are we at gathering size limited to 50 people? And when will we be changing? So I want to make it very clear, this is all about the health metrics. Everything we're doing is based on the health metrics. This is not arbitrary. Right now, we are at between 100 and 200 new cases every day in Chicago. I think the most recent number I saw was 153, I believe, on a 7-day rolling average, which is great. We used to be at significantly higher than that. And the reason why we're ready for phase 4 is that our new cases per day have dropped below 200. And our incidence rate is only at about 5%. Only about 5% of cases are coming back positive, which again is great news. But within this case rate with about 100 to 200 cases a day, we will, as long as that is still the case, we will be limiting capacity to 25% and indoor gathering size to 50, outdoor gathering size to 100. And that's because the data shows with a gathering of 50 people right now, you have about 15% chance that somebody in that crowd has COVID-19. If we were to have gatherings of up to 100, it's about a 30% chance that someone in that gathering has COVID-19. So if we do come below, our goal is to get below 100. And once we get below 100, we'll consider moving to 50% capacity and 100 total gatherings. And then as you can see, Our ultimate goal is to get down below 20. That's when we can open up with 100% indoor capacity and up to 1,000 people at indoor gatherings. But we're not there yet. We're still a ways to go to get down before 20. And that's why these guidelines are so important. Again, I see a couple additional questions come through. We are close to wrapping up time. I'll run a couple minutes over in order to answer some questions. But again, if I do not answer your question, I do apologize. There's a lot of questions. We have over 150 attendees. So please send an email to me at bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org. And I'll get clarification, as I said, on the question about performers, if they count towards a 50 capacity. And I will be communicating that via email to everybody that attended this webinar. Right. So, couple questions. So, how often will this risk level capacity be assessed? Our health department is assessing this every single day. I want to make clear, see the note on the bottom. The day we get below 100, it's not like we will immediately move to 50%. This is all subject to the guidance from the health department. This is not something, I'm from the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Department. I'm not establishing these guidelines. The health department is. They're the ones that know. So questions about once we get to low, what the social distancing rules will be, that's something that's still to be determined, and that we will be evaluating that closely. So couple questions. How can customers pick their seats if they come with a group of 4? In order to stagger the vacant seats. Now, this is something that we're recommending that folks have people pick their seats ahead of time. If folks do come in within kind of the same group, they can potentially sit closer to each other. So we do know that obviously there's some challenges there, but that's something that we are encouraging as much as possible to minimize congregating and things like that. Great question, and I'm very glad this one just came through. Can concession stands operate at movie theaters? Yes, because concession stands can operate at movie theaters. We do recommend that folks read the food service guidelines, and I'm actually doing a webinar at 11 a.m. today on food service to understand a little bit more about food service. But yes, concessions can operate at movie theaters, and people can eat at their seats or drink at their seats, again, while they're seated and while they are social distancing. But please do follow, the food service guidelines for that. That's also for museums that are still on here. If a museum has a restaurant, they should be following the food service guidelines for that restaurant. And a question, should staff that have contact with visitors regularly encouraged to test? I would recommend that you take a look at the chicago.gov/coronavirus site, and there's detailed instructions on who should be tested. The important thing is if you think you've had contact with someone with COVID-19, then you should be tested. Again, a question just came in about mask wearing and social distancing at all risk levels. Again, as we have not gotten down to that next level, we will have specific guidelines to go along with all of these different levels. So that is still, as of yet, undetermined at this point. But I promise we'll be doing more webinars, and we will be communicating those as they come. What is recommended in regards to temperature check for guests? At minimum, you are required to post a pledge at your entrance saying that customers should not enter without COVID-19. However, you can do more than that. We are encouraging more than that. I had a question, great question. I run private events and music venues. I'm interested in how these guidelines affect weddings, general, where there's a lot of standing around. All guests must be seated. What does that mean for weddings? So even for weddings, and I did a presentation yesterday for hotels and for food service, which had a lot of questions related to this. When folks are eating and drinking, they must be seated. That means cocktail hours where folks are mingling all about cannot happen unless folks are seated. So again, anytime someone is eating or drinking, they must be seated. Had a question, do drive-in movie theaters have the 100 capacity? So drive-in movie theaters where everybody is separately in their car would not constitute, an outdoor gathering like this. So they would not have that same 100 capacity. For outdoor events are portable bathrooms acceptable? Yes, but you should be following the same guidelines that we have here related to bathrooms, namely, full sanitize, full and frequent disinfecting and cleaning. Are audience members allowed to interact with the performers? They can do so provided that 6 feet of distance is maintained. Again, I do apologize. I do need to wrap up. I know there are additional questions coming through. I do apologize that I was unable to answer every question. Again, please email BACP Outreach, and I will get answers to those questions. And again, I do have to hop on. We have another webinar for retail starting at 10 that I need to hop onto. Please let me know. Please email us if you have any questions. The thing I really do want to emphasize is the importance of following these guidelines, the importance of recognizing that we're not out of this crisis yet, and that we all still need to do what we can to prevent any further outbreaks. So thank you again. I will follow up via email to everybody about the question about performers. And if you have any other questions, please send us an email, bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org. Thank you, everybody.